Welcome to Bible Answers Now. Today we're diving into a fascinating question. Why didn't God allow Jonah to refuse his mission? Was Jonah's disobedience truly beyond his control, or did God override his free will? Let's take a closer look at what the Bible says. Jonah's story begins in the book of Jonah, where we find the prophet being called by God to go to Nineveh, a city known for its wickedness. But instead of obeying God's command, Jonah tries to flee in the opposite direction, hopping aboard a ship bound for Tarshish. This dramatic refusal of God's call seems to raise the question, if Jonah had free will, why didn't God simply let him walk away? First, let's examine Jonah 1:1-3. In these verses, God commands Jonah, "Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me." But Jonah, refusing the mission, attempts to escape. In his mind, running away to Tarshish was a way to avoid what seemed like a daunting and uncomfortable task. However, despite Jonah's best efforts to flee, God pursues him. Why did God take such drastic measures? Why didn't God just let Jonah choose? The answer lies in the nature of God's calling and the consequences of disobedience. In Romans 11 verse 29, Paul writes, "For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable." God's calling on Jonah's life wasn't negotiable. It wasn't a suggestion or a light request. Jonah was chosen, and God would not let him escape his destiny. Jonah's disobedience, though, didn't go unchallenged. God used a storm to stop Jonah's flight in Jonah 1:4-5, where we read, "Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up." The sailors, terrified by the storm, cast lots and discovered that Jonah was the cause of the turbulence. Jonah, realizing that God was in control, ultimately confesses and is thrown overboard. As soon as he's cast into the sea, the storm ceases. But God's pursuit doesn't end there. Jonah 1:17 tells us that God sends a great fish to swallow Jonah, giving him 3 days and nights in its belly to reflect on his disobedience. This was not merely a punishment. It was God's way of getting Jonah's attention and preparing him for the mission ahead. Now, some might argue that Jonah had free will. And yes, he certainly did. Jonah could have chosen to obey from the start, but he didn't. However, God's persistent intervention reveals something deeply important. While we do have the freedom to choose, God will sometimes act in ways that lead us back to his will, especially when our calling has great significance for his kingdom. Just like a loving parent who corrects a child, God does not abandon his children when they stray. Instead, he lovingly redirects them, even if it means using difficult circumstances to bring them back to his path. This leads us to Jonah 3:1-3, where we see God's grace on full display. After Jonah's time in the belly of the fish, God gives him a second chance, commanding him once again to go to Nineveh. Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time, "Go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim to it the message I give you." Jonah, now humbled and repentant, obeys. He goes to Nineveh, and the city, to his surprise, repents. God shows mercy, and Jonah's mission, though reluctantly accepted, results in great spiritual change. So why didn't God just let Jonah refuse? Because God had a divine plan for Nineveh, and Jonah was the chosen messenger. God knew that despite Jonah's reluctance, his obedience was vital for the salvation of the city. And Jonah's story is a reminder to us that God's calling on our lives is not just for our own benefit. It often involves the lives of others. Even when we resist, God will find ways to move his work forward, sometimes through circumstances that seem difficult but are actually opportunities for growth and transformation. Think about your own life for a moment. Have you ever felt called to do something difficult or uncomfortable only to run the other way? Maybe it's a difficult conversation you've been avoiding, a ministry opportunity you've hesitated to step into, or even a relationship that needs healing. God doesn't always force us to act, but he will guide and correct us to fulfill his purposes. If you've ever been in a place where you felt God nudging you to do something, remember Jonah's story. He resisted, but God's purpose still prevailed. So what can we learn from Jonah's mission? First, we learn that God's calling is not always easy. It often challenges our comfort zones and calls us into the unknown. But it also shows us that God's grace is relentless. Even when we fall short, he gives us second chances to fulfill his will. Finally, we see that God's plans are much bigger than our personal comfort. Jonah's obedience led to the salvation of an entire city, proving that when we trust God, He can use us in ways we never imagined. As we reflect on this, think about what God might be calling you to do. Maybe it's time to stop running and trust that His way is best. Pray and ask God for the courage to obey, even when it's hard. And remember, His grace will always meet you where you are, ready to redirect you back onto His path. Thanks so much for joining us today on Bible Answers Now. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What's something God has called you to that you've been hesitant to follow? Share it in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this message with someone who might need encouragement today. Let's encourage each other to listen to God's voice, even when it feels hard. May God bless you and your loved ones as you walk in His will.